like to introduce you and bring a wonderful man who is doing some incredible work for us to dive deeper into that integration and excavation of ourselves, and that which keeps us feeling in the illusion or being in the illusion of separateness. His name is Francis Weller. He is a psychotherapist, a writer, and soul activist. He is a synthesizer, similar to Charles, of diverse streams of thought from psychology, anthropology, mythology, alchemy, indigenous cultures, and poetic traditions. He is the author of The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals and Renewal in the Sacred Work of Grief. He founded and directs the Wisdom Bridge, an organization that offers educational programs that seeks to integrate the wisdom from indigenous cultures with the insight and knowledge gathered from Western poetic, psychological, and spiritual tradition. I had the great pleasure of meeting Francis and having a conversation with him, and we just went so deep so quickly, and I'm just so excited to bring him on and have him share some of his wisdom.
Thank you. Lovely to be back with you.
So Francis, hold on, I'm trying to put you on speaker view. Here we go. Okay, now you're full. We have been talking a lot about grief, actually, and a lot of the conversation this week came up around our history, the history of this country. In this case, I'm speaking of the U.S. We can speak about other countries in terms of history of colonization. We talked a lot about trauma and our inner trauma, whether it's familial or just trauma from incidents that might happen to all of us. So grief has been very, very present. And I think where we could start is to talk about your own exploration of grief and the gift that it can bring for us. And also, how then we can be with our own grief, with each other's grief, and with a collective grief.
So we'll start with a small question.
Like I said, we went deep real fast.
Okay. Let's see. I have been a psychotherapist for nearly 40 years. And what you see when you're sitting with people for any length of time is that the majority of what we're dealing with is undigested grief. Mm-hmm. Even when people come in saying they're dealing with depression, it's actually more of an oppression. It is the sediment of untouched and untended sorrows that just kind of begin to weigh down upon us over time and oppress us and bring us flat to the ground. Part of the problem we face is that we live in a grief-phobic culture. So even when we sense into the grief, we rarely know how to approach it. So a lot of my work has been trying to reestablish a certain quality of faith in the intent of grief. We tend to sense that grief wants to take us hostage, that it wants to kind of occupy our lives and kind of dominate. Well, actually it wants to deepen and ripen. The beauty of grief is that it has, in its sense, the qualities of a tremendous solvent. It can soften the hardest places in the heart. So once we begin to engage grief openly, the heart begins to extend itself back out into the world. The more isolated we feel, the more cut off we feel, as Charles was saying, that whole mythology of separation, the more the heart has to go into protective modes of survival. Well, what grief does is it begins to open us back up into that felt sense of intimacy with not only my life, but with the whole surrounding watershed, with the community, with all living beings. So that's where I would start, just inviting us to begin to reimagine a deeper fidelity to the presence of sorrow in our life.
Thank you, Francis. So when we invite grief and we hold our grief and develop that intimacy, one of the things that sometimes happens for me and for some is that that's really hard to do. Can you just give us some techniques or some points of how do we understand how to enter that grief?
Well, and the hardest thing that we are challenged with is how much we've learned to privatize grief.
Mm.
The moment you privatize grief, you're in trouble, because grief, in order to be moved and worked, requires two things: requires containment and requires release. Well, in the privatization of this culture, I have to do both jobs, and you can't. You cannot simultaneously contain and release. You need community to help you release grief. You need the container to be provided so you can fall to your knees, so you can weep unself-consciously. But that's a long ways from where we stand right now, which is very private, very heroic. We try to muscle our way through grief. So we actually kind of have a distrusting relationship to sorrow. So we have to, one of the images that came to me many years ago is that for most of us, our grief doesn't have a bottom. So when we get close to it, it feels like free fall. And so the work right now is to slowly get our hands underneath our grief again and to begin, like I said, to build some faith in it. Grief is around us all the time. You don't have to go looking for it. It comes knocking every single day, whether it's, the roadkill on the side of the road that you see, like I see every day coming to work, or the news that we ingest every day, the ancestral grief that we carry. It's always there. And if we can begin to pay attention to it, it's what I call take up an apprenticeship with sorrow.
Mm.
A long walk with sorrow. It's not an event. You're not having just a period of mourning. You're walking alongside of melancholy every day. Which on one hand that sounds depressing, but on the other hand, no, because what I talk about is that the mark of a mature human being is the capacity to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and to be stretched large by these two presences in our life. If we only choose one or the other, it doesn't work. If we only choose grief, over time we will become bitter and the heart will close. If we only choose gratitude, we remain somewhat superficial. Our capacity for compassion for other people's suffering is diminished. But together, grief and gratitude, they, in a sense, form the prayer of life. They're there simultaneously. You can be in the midst of your deepest sorrow and catch a glimpse of something stunning, beautiful, and your heart feels touched by it. Side by side, constantly. As long as we begin to, take that apprenticeship seriously, it will take us someplace. It's part of our deep, I really believe that we don't ripen as human beings without a deep relationship to sorrow.
I am taking your words into my heart as it's almost like a soothing balm.
Mm.
Yeah, and I am thinking, and what comes up is this piece of, like, I think Stephen Levine spoke of some of the most joyful people he knows have been those who have investigated their grief the most. And so as you're saying that gratitude and grief,
Mm-hmm.
scratch. But the other piece that you're speaking about is apprenticing to sorrow.
Yes.
I'm gonna step back and I'm gonna let you just tell me what that means and how could I be apprentice to sorrow.
Okay. Why I like the idea of apprenticeship, because built into the idea is a long, prolonged study. You know, in the old ideas of apprenticeship, you would apprentice with a master carpenter or a weaver or a potter or a painter. And you would do that for 5, 10, sometimes 20 years you would study. That's a long apprenticeship. It's a long, faithful practice. And at the end of that apprenticeship, you would be considered a master. In my work with soul and with grief, this apprenticeship over the long term doesn't lead to mastery, it leads to elderhood. So to become an elder is someone who has really digested a lifetime and perhaps generations of sorrows and has come skillfully through that to take up that place of holding a presence for sorrow in the community. And that's what we need much, much more of. Back to the idea of apprenticeship. The apprenticeship covers about 5 different things. So let me just lay those out. The first one in the apprenticeship is learning to come into right relationship to sorrow. We have kind of a binary relationship to grief. We either repress it, push it away, or we drown in it. What the apprenticeship says is we have to come into more of a companionship with it, as if we are walking side by side with sorrow every day. And we are. So it's a prolonged intimacy. That's the first part of the apprenticeship. The second part is that we need to have some kind of practice. I came across a wonderful term some years ago by Kathleen Dean Moore, where she wrote a book called Hold Fast. And a hold fast, if you go out to the coast, which we can't go out to right now, but when you can go out to the coast, you see the kelp beds. And they're waving in the waves. Sometimes the storms come in. And a hold fast is the chemical bond between the bulb of the plant and the rock beneath it. That's what a practice gives us. It gives us something to hold on to when the storms come, and the storms do come. Every one of us in this room today has had, big tidal surges of grief, pain, trauma, loss, suffering, personally or communally. The third part of the practice is migrating the grief from the child's hands into the adult's hands. Now, we could spend hours unpacking this one thought. Many of us did not have our grief held adequately in our childhood. And frequently that's where the grief got stuck. So it feels every time the grief comes up, and I've seen this so many times in my grief rituals, suddenly the look on that face changes from an adult face to a petrified child's face. And you know that they have just left the room. And sometimes they literally want to run out of the room. And when I can help them to stop and pause and say, what's happening right now? Can you be with that fear? The moment they can be with the fear, they've moved from the child state into the adult state. It's a very simple move, but it's so essential. Again, most of our grief is carried in the child state. So when grief comes up, our normal range of skill sets collapses down into endurance, avoidance, numbness. We collapse into survival. And what we want to do is, again, return this into the hands of an adult who has the capacity to hold the intensity of what's going on. So it's important for us to remember that grief is not just an emotion, but it is a core faculty of being human. It's a skill. And most of us are very unskilled in knowing how to navigate this territory. So this third move about moving it from the child into the adult is absolutely crucial. The fourth one is coming to have a deep appreciation for the necessity of silence and solitude. I emphasize group work so much, the necessity of community, but the reality is much of the time that we spend with our grief will be alone. And so how do we not just endure those times? Because grief, again, doesn't want us just to endure it. It wants us to engage it. So in the silence and the solitude, they become kind of the places of hospitality for us to come into relationship to that grief. I tell a story in one of my books about a woman I was sitting with, and she said, I hate going home at night. She was going through a very difficult divorce, and she said, I hate going home at night. I said, why is that? She said, well, the place is so cold and so dark, and I'm all alone. And I asked her, could you imagine it as the holiest time of day? She says, what do you mean? He says, well, when you open the door, you are greeting your most vulnerable self, the part of you that feels abandoned, the part of you that feels lonely, the part of you that's in deep grief. Can you come in the door and say, let's turn on the heat, let's make some soup, let's have a cup of tea, and tell me about your sorrow today? And then I remember this line of Rilke where he said, I am too alone in the world, but not alone enough to make every minute holy. Now, what a remarkable pivot he makes. We all know that place of feeling too alone in the world, right? We feel lonely at times, but he makes this move, but not alone enough to make every minute holy. When he does that, he's creating sanctuary. And that's part of the invitation in this shelter in place, is can we treat it more as a hermitage, as a time of, coming into a deeper intimacy with our own soul. It's easier for introverts than it is for extroverts, but that's part of the invitation. And the last part of the apprenticeship is self-compassion. I've often written that what grief work does is it opens the heart to compassion for others. But I neglected to say in those writings that to get to my own grief, I have to cultivate my own self-compassion. I have to feel as if my sorrows are worthy of my attention. For some reason, we have been taught that our own pain and our own grief doesn't deserve that quality of mindfulness and attention and mercy and gentleness. We are much kinder to other people than we are to ourselves. So when I give workshops on self-compassion, I often begin by saying, well, this is a weekend in non-self-improvement. And there's usually lots of laughter, but we are addicted to self-improvement. And there's a quality of self-hatred in that self-improvement oftentimes. And soul will not participate in any gesture that has at its base self-hatred. So we have to begin to turn that around into a place of self-compassion, that my suffering matters. And the sorrows of others matter too, but yes, my sorrows matter too. And we can get into great comparisons. The sorrows of the world are much more important than my own little grief. But as I say, I'm talking about the 5 gates of grief. It doesn't matter what gate you enter. We all end up in the communal hall of shared sorrows. And that's the work that's at hand right now, is coming into that communal hall of our shared grief. And in that place, it doesn't matter what the flavor of your sorrow looks like. It is the fact that your heart knows suffering just like mine. And in that place, we are all bound together in a profound intimacy. Yeah. So that's just a little nutshell of the apprenticeship.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated your guidance. And you spoke when you were sharing, you were speaking of the rituals, the grief rituals when you lead them. Can you share a little bit more about the grief ritual and that? And then also something came up what you were saying, that the ancestors, how do we honor and deal with ancestors and grief rituals?
Well, let's start with that one. The ancestral grief. The more I sit with people and the more I sit with them in circle, the more I realize that much of the grief they're carrying is not theirs. As Rumi said, it began in some other tavern. It began long ago. The threads of grief that we're carrying and all the research they're doing now on transgenerational transmission of trauma, we are the current curators of the grief. But it may not just be mine. So when we sit with any kind of ancestral lineage, there's a lot of untouched, unwept grief. There could be stories of alcoholism or abandonment or betrayal or divorces or the leaving of the homes. There's so many pieces of grief that's attached to these threads that in our progressive fantasy, we're only supposed to be paying attention to what's happening now. But much of what I'm carrying, as I've said, is what I've inherited. So that comes up frequently in the grief rituals. Now, many, many cultures have rituals to attend to grief. And what we offer is an amalgam. It's a kind of a distillation of a lot of traditional practices because we have forgotten our practices for the most part. And I had the great good fortune of training with Malidoma and Sabon Fusome back in the mid-90s. And I learned a lot about the architecture of ritual and the necessity of ritual. That Malidoma once said there are certain things that can only happen in ritual space. And I think one of the things that we're anxious for or in great need of is ritual space around grieving. Because psyche, when people come into my office, they touch the edges of grief, but I say, at some point, you're learning right now to tolerate contact with your grief, but you'll need a larger body of containment to release it. If we go deep enough into our story, we know that grief has always been communal. It has never been private. It has never been mine to deal with alone. So when we go back into ritual space, some part of our psyche goes, this is the field I've been waiting for. I can't tell you how many times after a ritual is over, somebody will say, I've never done anything like this before. But it's strange, it felt strangely familiar. Well, yes, because we are wired for this. Some anthropologists and archaeologists think that we were probably doing ritual before we had language. So in some ways, ritual is the oldest language we speak. It is an archaic, ancient language that when we enter into ritual space, some part of our psyche quickens, it awakens, it recognizes that these are the parameters that I have been waiting for in order to go where I need to go. Grief and ritual invites the capacities for derangement, which scares the hell out of us because we are taught to be in control at all times. We feel ashamed when we apologize when we lose control. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cry. But what ritual does, it actually sets the tone, sets the resonant field for derangement. We don't want to come out of the ritual the same as we went in. We want to come out changed. And the derangement is required because the current arrangement is not working any longer. And we need to be rearranged in some way that is a closer approximation to what the soul wants us to embody. So the grief rituals are really an invitation to re-enter the primary matrix, the field that we are always anticipating and always expecting, which is at the core of our grief, actually. When we start our grief ritual weekends, I often say it is so strange that we need a workshop on grief. I say that is part of our deep grief right there. We've had people travel from Australia, from England, Germany, just for the privilege of being able to grieve side by side with another human being. Can you hear how much sorrow is laced in that reality? How much we have forgotten? I say the two primary sins of our culture are amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. And in our great forgetting, we forgot that we need each other in order to grieve. I can't do it alone. I just cannot do this alone. There's a wonderful line by Ira Progroff. He said, this is the solitary journey we cannot do alone. No one can grieve my grief, right? No one can take it. But I will need you to help me in order to get to that place of being able to express it fully. I need you. In a functioning ecology of the sacred, my need is your invitation to show up and bring medicine. Just as your grief might be Lisa's invitation to bring her medicine to you. But if that is silence, which it is in a shame-bound culture like we live in, if my need for attention and help is silenced, then you're spiritually unemployed, which is another piece of our grief. We don't feel needed. We feel cosmically insignificant when the absolute opposite is the truth. We are so fundamentally essential for each other's well-being, but we have forgotten that in our addiction to individualism and privatization, and even in our psychological systems of deep interiority, as if all my work goes on in here. But Jung had a wonderful phrase. He said, the soul cannot become itself without an other, which is always found in a you. So for me, even to become most Francis, I need Victoria.
And I need you.
Yes, yeah. I love the idea that we were made perfectly inadequate. That we were designed perfectly inadequately, so that I cannot make the journey all by myself. And weakness and need are fundamentally saying, all they're saying is, I can't take the next step without your assistance. That's all it's saying. It isn't a commentary on my worthlessness. It just says that the load right now requires 2 or more. And would you walk with me the next few steps? And then you'll ask me. The San Bushmen have this ritual they do every week at dusk. And there's a recognition that when one of us is ill, all of us are ill. Isn't that amazing? We feel ashamed when we feel sick. And here we are in this massive pandemic. When one of us is sick, all of us are sick.
Mm-hmm.
That means that we have to have a response that is communal, not private.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when someone in the community is sick, that means that something in the community needs to be healed.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So
Yeah.
here we are. Here we are. Which I want to create a little space to let everyone who wants to ask you a question, because speaking about we needing each other, right?
Yeah.
The community, this is why we have this gathering, right? People are wanting to be with each other and wanting to connect. And I'm sure there's lots of questions for you. So could we open it up now? Would you?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Please raise your hand if you have a question for Francis. And Mauricio and Zaya, would you go ahead and...
I just wonder if we could touch one more element, Francis, maybe before we go into, and if you could say something about trauma and grief, because often trauma is what prevents us to actually experience grief. And what is the relationship, and do we need to do trauma healing work in order to touch grief, or can grief provide the healing itself?
Well, I think they're very entangled. Every trauma has grief in it. I call trauma a rough initiation. And the idea that goes with that is that every true initiatory event takes us into 3 thresholds. The first threshold is that there's a severance from the life you once knew. So when the trauma occurs, whether it's a violation of the body or soul, you've left a certain world. The second thing that happens in all authentic initiations is that there's a radical alteration in your sense of identity. That who I was is not any longer. And the third realization is that the world that I had left, I can never return to. And in a true initiatory thing, you don't want to return to the old world. Genuine initiation is a breakthrough into the widest aperture of identity. I begin to feel my allegiance to all things, my interdependency with all things. Trauma has the inverse effect. If the same 3 things happen, you're still going through an initiatory event, but there's a collapse into a singularity. I suddenly feel all alone and cut off from the living world. They've done some very interesting work with Native American soldiers coming back from Afghanistan with PTSD. And they put them through conventional trauma treatments, and they had about a 40% recovery rate. Then they say, well, let's try something else. They put them back into sweat lodges, into pipe ceremonies, and into vision quest. Well, the recovery rate went back up to like 80 to 90%. So why would that make any difference? Well, I envision trauma as a rupture in the coat of intimacy with cosmos. In a sense, you're torn out of the coat of belonging. And what ritual and community do is that it's an act of suturing the tear. So you are sutured back into a communal sense of belonging. And that's where the repair work has to happen. And that's where the grief work has to happen. So trauma and grief, there is no healing from trauma without ceremony, without ritual, without grief work, and without community. Those are the elemental constituents that allow the trauma to begin to repair, begin to heal. It's a big question, but hopefully we touched a little bit of.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a lot of questions. Betsy
Barnum. Yes.
Hello. Thank you so much for this talking about grief, Francis. It is so important for us to do that. We've had a lot of beautiful messages so far in this conference about ancestors and their presence and the meaningfulness of that. They're here, they're closer now. We're in a time of a thinning of the veil. I feel my ancestors closer to me. You said that some of the grief we carry is not ours. It belongs to our people in our lineage. And I'm wondering if there's a way that we can know what part is ours and what part isn't, if that matters, since we do know that our healing today heals them. We're healing together. But what difference would knowing that make to our own grieving if we could know that?
I don't know. I don't know if it would make that much difference. Partly because I think their experiences of being human are not that different than my experience of being human. The ruptures that happened, particularly in European ancestry and African history, ancestry, Native American ancestry, these are the things that I think are communally still very present. So to talk about it as something in the past is partly a misnomer. They're still here. The grief is still ripe and mostly untended, which is part of the reason why so much of the racial dynamics are still so inflamed, is what we have not turned to sit in that deep pool of untended grief. So it's right here, right now. And if we do tend to it, I do think it does mend both, well, in all directions, right? All times, past, present, future. It profoundly affects how we are with that.
So knowing which is which doesn't matter so much as expanding our own awareness that we are also carrying that grief from them.
That's right. Yeah. And thank you for your tears. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you, Betsy. Katie Hids. Yay.
Are you muted? Unmute yourself. Hold on.
No.
There you are.
Oh, good. That kind of gave me a chance to unmuting to take a breath. Man, everything you said, it's like you're speaking from the inside of my head. And the line about the necessary for solitude and grief, as soon as you said that, it just like, it's overwhelming, you know, like, and the question I have is that idea of containing it, that's the hard part I have. It does feel too deep and too overpowering. And I've just come out of some pretty strong addiction and a marriage ending. And so just getting a hold of not drinking has been hard enough, and some other addiction issues. And, you know, I have a therapist, and I do feel though that like I'm touching on it, but I can't quite get
that into it, especially in an hour. And I've done plant medicine work, and that was really overwhelming. Like it just felt like I was going crazy, like it was taking me too deep. And so I'm really afraid of not having a bottom to hold. And along with the addiction, you know, there's psych wards, and there's been some splits in being able to hold stuff. And so how do I enter ritual? How do I find container for that? You know, how does one dive into it enough to come through it, but without getting lost?
That's such a good question. I think we have to learn how to titrate our approach. I think just jumping into the deep end of the pool, not the best idea. Let's wade in a little bit shallower. I like to do what I call micro rituals. And in the afternoon session, I'm going to do a little writing practice with people. It's a good way to do it. You set a timer for 10 minutes. You work with the little prompt I give you, and you write and you write and you write, and you touch it, and then you're able to step out. You learn to begin to build your faith again, that I can enter that room without drowning. I can enter that room without free fall. I can begin to have a relationship. But they go slowly, be very patient. James Hillman said, "In your patience is your soul." We're very impatient. We want things now. I want to get through this grief now. Well, you're not going to get through the grief. Grief will change as you tend it, and it will change you as you tend it. You will ripen and deepen as a human being, but slowly build up your relationship with it. Write a letter to grief. Personify it. Tell it you're scared shitless of walking into that room. And understandably, partly because you're being asked to do it all alone. And our psyches are wise enough to go, I need more help than this. I'm not enough by myself. But again, that's that silence and solitude. You're going to be alone with a lot of this grief. So what can I do? Well, you can court it. You can begin to write love letters to your grief. You can, or a fear letter to your grief. You can do the writing practices that I give you. You can build a shrine to your grief. There's ways you can begin to build a relationship with it, that you slowly begin to trust it. And then when we are permitted again to have 3 or 4 friends over and say, tonight, the topic is sorrow and loss. We'll say a prayer or say a poem. We'll light a candle. But the rules are no advice giving. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It's a presence awaiting witnessing. Our grief needs to be witnessed. It needs to be heard. It needs to be honored. And we need to see it in the eyes of another that my losses were seen and that they matter. So invite people over once we can and just begin to tell our stories. We're just dying for that permission for someone to say, you know, it's okay to talk about this. Because by and large, we cannot talk about this on the street. How are you? I'm fine. But I'm not. My heart is breaking. You know? So I hope that helped a little bit.
There's some great ideas. Thank you. The writing I've tried, but I try and write about my experience and what's happened, and that's diving right in, and it just brings everything back, and it's just too much. Yeah. So
low entry, little bits.
Yeah.
Build your muscle. This is a muscle. You know, I call it a skill and a faculty, but it's a strength. It's a core strength. And the more we can learn to hold and be in relationship to it, in a sense, the bigger we become. I think the work right now is about immensity. Mm-hmm. How much can I get my arms around? It's fine for us to get our arms around hope and love and peace, but we also have to get our arms around dread and fear and panic and death and grief. We have to become immense human beings right now. Anything smaller will not cut it.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your tender heart with us.
Thank you.
Jamie Powell? Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for having Francis on this program. And Francis, thank you for all that you've shared so far. when this conference started this week, Bayo Akomolafe referenced Ahmaud Arbery's murder. And I want to, with great care and respect, open up a question, a comment question about, and I feel my own tears coming. As a person with white skin, in a world where white supremacy is, in my perspective and so many that I speak with, the cause of not only so much of the suffering of the people, but also the devastation of the planet. How do we create spaces for mourning and grief that don't simultaneously steal from other cultures, cultural appropriation, and things of this nature? And so it's a big topic for me and for our world. But as a white person, I'm also in a biracial partnership, and we have our intimate grief, and then we also facilitate events in the community. And I find the lines getting very blurry about what is mine to grieve, and when to step back and when to hold space. So if you can find a question in there, I guess it's just any perspective that you have on the sacred tending of such very, very sensitive material, both personally from a personal perspective as well as a collective perspective.
Yeah, again, thank you for that. I think that's a core question right now. My personal approach to it is that we cannot take rituals from any other culture because we can't just applique another tradition's practices onto who we are, in this culture. What's transferable are the values of traditional cultures: respect, gratitude, restraint, which is our least developed spiritual value in this culture, by the way, mutuality. The values are translatable. The practices have to be particular. So the rituals that we do here, that I have been doing, have been dreamt up from this land. We have been given rituals. I had the wonderful privilege of teaching with Malidoma for 6 years. And we would come into our time together and see what rituals needed to happen. And many of the rituals that we did, I remember doing one ritual, he looked at me and said, "That's the first indigenous ritual I've seen on this continent," because it was not from some other culture. It was dreamt up here. We are dreaming creatures. We are creatures of deep ritual, but we have to listen again and hear from the earth. See, I think the earth is a dreaming creature, and she expresses herself primarily in image and ritual. And if we can listen, I think we'll be given the rituals we need to do now to repair, to mend the great rips and tears in our own psyches and our cultural psyche and the transcultural psyche. So I really appreciate your question because it's something I have dealt with a lot. I hopefully answered your question. I don't know. But.
Francis, if I might add a little something here as well. Yeah. I did some work also with the other partner of the Somé family, with Sabonfu. Somé, who was specifically sent to the US to come and teach people here how to grieve, right? And she would say that if people were trying to replicate the rituals based upon Burkina Faso or in the Yoruba tradition, that if they were not initiated in that it could actually make you mad, right? With the way that you will hold the grief. And so at the same time, there is that piece of some tradition here, some Native American traditions, where they actually initiate a white-skinned person to be part of the carrier of those rituals. And that's really speaking about right relationship, right? So it's really about the right relationship and making visible where that comes from in the lineage that you're holding. So a white person could hold a lineage that might be of indigenous nature, but that has to be with a lot of respect, a lot of responsibility, a lot of mutuality, so that it is not expropriating or extracting, which is that same mentality that, right, have created the extraction of the earth, right? So just wanted to add that piece.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very important to honor lineages. Whenever I teach, I'm always trying to bring in whose shoulders am I standing on? Who blessed me with their wisdom and their practices to help me do what I'm doing right now? So absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that piece in.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank
Very
you.
beautiful question. Lakshmi.
You're unmuted.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Francis. We met at Yanni's funeral last year. So
yes.
yeah, thank you so much. And I wanted to ask, and some of the questions were kind of answered in the previous questions about how you do ritual and how you invite other people to ritual and authenticity. But and what I hear you saying is it's about intuition. And I wonder if there's more you could say and how you guide people to follow their intuition. You know, I know dreaming is one language, but it doesn't resonate for everybody, about creating their own ritual, or about how we can create ritual in this time where ritual is so much about gathering and together and the dimensionality of the elements, the earth and the fire and water. And just wondering if you could speak to that, how you guide people to work in ritual and in community and developing ritual out of their own intuition.
Well, ritual in a sense arises out of need, right? There's a necessity. Something happens in the community, in your own personal life, and you recognize that there's a need here. So you begin with that. There's in a sense, a plea. There's a need. From there, you invite image. What images begin to come? Whether it's you and I sitting and percolating images. What is it that's coming and beginning to take shape and form? And then what is the gesture? What movements are required in this process? I think what we need to be willing to do is fail a lot. We're addicted to success. Like this, we have to have this figured out. There's a word in Maladoma's village, and the word is Yilbangura. And the word means the things that knowledge cannot eat. I love this idea. We're never going to figure our way through this, okay? We can't think our way through ritual, but we can feel it. And I have had a lot of rituals fail. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, learned a lot by that failure. You know, so let's be willing to experiment. Let's try things. And if you have a success, tell others about it. This one worked. This one moved things and things. There was enough containment and enough pressure and enough heat, and things cooked and moved, and it was beautiful. We have to learn again. We have to be willing to try. And like I said, I'd rather fail 1,000 times than either try to steal something or to ignore something. We have to experiment right now. And ritual can be very, very simple. It doesn't have to have a lot of complex moving parts. It can be very, very simple. Like I was saying to Kathy before, just a group of people sitting in a circle with prayer and intention and transparency. Ritual is an invocation of the transpersonal. It has a certain quality of pitch. So you're always trying to aim that pitch at something beyond the human, so that the energies of that dimension can support what we're trying to do in this dimension. You know.
I love the idea of, you know, it not needing to get it right. And also I think about not approaching it with our limited minds, but out of that need for connection with the greater, which is that ultimate healing, the ultimate holding of the sorrow. And I almost like this idea of like feeding the dragons, like asking the grief, what do you need right now? Or asking the wholeness, what do you need right now?
That's a perfect question.
Then there is no failure. There's just what emerges.
Yeah, that's a perfect question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Lakshmi.
Lakshmi.
Paul, you are unmuted. Yeah.
Hi. All right. Hi. So you said so many things, Francis, that just lit me up. I probably have 20 questions, but I'll just reduce it to one. So something that, of the many things that you said that resonated with me was that much of our grief is not our own,
Yes.
or that was your discovery. Being that this is science and non-duality, I was curious on, and this is my first time hearing you talk, so forgive me if this is out of line or anything, but the combination of awakening experiences and possibly something like weak ego boundaries or something like that, where we not only are taking on more grief, but these awakening experiences can just blow us up, and empty us out, and really even show us that we aren't our ego, or we're the wordless or whatever. I guess two questions here. The one, there's the kind of growing connection between that these experiences don't heal everything. These awakening experiences don't heal everything. And two, now that you are not limited to your own identity, even your own culture, it seems like there could be potential to even make that process worse of taking everybody else's grieving on. If you had any thoughts on that, if that sparked anything in you.
Well, there is a definite necessity of hygiene. We want to keep emptying the cup. So we need, if we were living in a sane culture, there'd be a grief ritual happening every week someplace in the community. But we're not a sane culture. So we have to have practices that consistently return us to our ground. The other part of what got triggered in your question, Paul, is I do feel it is part of our soul responsibility, our spiritual obligation, to become the receptor site for the sorrows of the world. That's part of our initiation. That's part of our maturation. If we don't register these rips and tears, who will? I shared a story of driving through a clear cut up in Northern California, and driving through there, my whole being responded to this clear cut. Now, I could either interpret that as, well, it's a projection from me onto the clear cut of my own inner losses, or I could be seeing it as, I am the receptor site to register the sorrows of this land. That's my spiritual obligation. Because if I don't feel it, again, who will give voice to it? I think we will. Part of why I'm so much an advocate for grief work is because I feel it is through that gate that we will actually once again fall in love with the world. I think grief has the chance to save our butts here. It's through the broken heart that we will restore an affection for the world. Wendell Berry says it all turns on affection. So how does my affection manifest? Well, if I'm driving through a clear cut and I start weeping, that's my affection. That's my love for the world. It's being felt in that precise moment as sorrel and owl and lichen and fern and redwood and bay, and all those deaths are registered in my heart. But I have to keep it moving. Denise Lebertau had a little poem. She said, to speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. So if we don't speak of sorrow, the access point to our own soul will become congested, and we will lose that intimacy with our own deepest nature. So we have to keep it moving. In alchemy, they say, once the material is in the vessel, you have to keep the material warm, or the experiment will fail. Too much heat and it turns to ash. Too little heat and it hardens and congeals. And that's what happens for most of us. Too little warmth. We don't pay enough attention to our sorrows, and they harden and congeal and congest in our beings. And then we feel a limited range of life. I often say we live in a flatline culture where the range of emotion is so limited. Because we've dropped that lower register of grief, we've collapsed the upper register of joy. And now we live in this tiny band. It's hard for me to answer questions without riffing on all kinds of things. So
Oh, no, that was, thank you
that's
so
all
much.
right.
Before we go to another question from
Paul, I just wanted to bring one element you actually asked, and I think it's very important for in our community that we often have the idea that once we have a spiritual experience or an awakening experience, then that's it. And
Right.
what I'm hearing, I think the work of grief is really like it's inviting us to kind of simmer, to integrate, to continue, because there is no end to the work of grief. It never ends. So the spiritual awakening, the awakening experience, they really kind of clear the fog or lift the veil so we can start actually the journey. And I don't know if Francis, you have anything to add about spiritual experience or awakening experiences.
I appreciate them. My work is more in the direction of soul, which is kind of the descending route. I really appreciate, I need more of that ascension route. You don't want to get mired in soul because it can become very dense and thick. We do need spiritual practices to keep that lineage between soul and spirit intact.
Francis, before we get another question from the audience, we're beginning to touch about keeping it moving, not letting it congeal. Can you speak a little bit more about the piece around grief and illness?
Well, illness is certainly a carrier of grief. I mean, it's places where we encounter our limitations, our diminishment, the portent of death. So many things get triggered when we get sick, even with a cold. We somehow feel vulnerable, less heroic and powerful. We come in touch with our weakness, maybe our need for comfort and care. So it evokes a lot. When Jung had his heart attack, he said he called it a great exfoliation or defoliation of soul, of psyche. That it shed things, it peeled away things. Illness is like, in alchemy, they would call it the time in the Negredo, in the blackening, when things decay and die and end and shed. And we need those times. We need them. Illness can be a profound initiatory time. I remember working with a man once who had a pretty serious heart attack. And he came into my office and started talking about wanting to get back into his job and get back into his position of authority and power. And I said, wait a minute, I'm afraid you're going to waste a perfectly good heart attack. You know, have you ever stopped to think that your heart might be asking you to do something different, that it might not like what you're doing? You know, so illness has ways of breaking us open to things that we could never imagine before. I think it was Andre Gide who says that illness opens windows to a perception that remains closed to the healthy point of view. So illness, weakness, vulnerability, they show us something else about who we are and about what we need. And there's always that thread of grief that comes along with that. And grief, again, is our way of acknowledging and honoring what is happening to us, to our relationships, to our community.
Thank you, Victoria. Beautiful question. Thank you. Patricia.
Patricia,
you are muted.
Co-food?
Co-food.
Co-food.
Yes,
Thank you.
hello. Thank you for taking my question. My husband and I have taken on a young man, he's in his early 30s, because during the COVID, he would have been very much alone. And he's been in and out of the hospital with panic attacks. And it's only since coming to these meetings that you are having that it occurred to me to ask him about his past. And I found that his mother was killed when he was 6, his father when he was 8. And I thought that this grief was never touched. He has panic attacks. He cannot be alone. We have him for dinner every night. And I'm wondering, is there a way to help someone whose grief has solidified so he can't even approach it? He goes like almost blank, doesn't know. How do you open someone up when they have been closed by circumstance?
Beautiful question. First, I would just say that frequently when people express grief, it's never a clean presentation. It's never just grief, or rarely it's just grief. It's often grief panic, grief terror, grief anxiety. That they have become fused together, partly because they haven't been given a bottom. We get terrified. So one thing you can do with him is help him to come in relationship. That third step of the apprenticeship I mentioned about moving it from the child's hands into the adults. You can help him by just saying, can you be with this part of you that feels afraid right now? Can you turn toward that? There's a wonderful book called The Trauma of Everyday Life by Mark Epstein. And Mark shares the story that basically he's taking the Buddha as a patient. And the Buddha's mother died when he was 6 days old. And so Epstein was curious about, well, how did the Buddha or the to-be Buddha respond to this? Well, he said this first effort was to try to transcend it, to try to go above it, beyond it, that spiritual bypass that we talk about. Well, that didn't work. He said then the Buddha, the to-be Buddha, went out and he tried to purge himself from those feelings of existential grief and dread. That didn't work. Then he said, according to the texts, that one day, Siddhartha was sitting and he turned and had a memory of himself as a 6-year-old boy. He said, in that moment, he said, he turned toward his suffering like the mother he never had. He said that was the beginning of the middle way. So we have to bring great compassion to that panic. But we have to have, Jung said, you cannot heal what you cannot separate from. So you can help him to separate from that panic and become a presence capable of holding that panic. Can you turn towards this anxious part of you, this part of you that felt absolutely bereft and abandoned as an 8-year-old child? Can you be a presence for this part of you? The moment you can get him to begin to even think that way, he's begun the separation. The separation is crucial. It's the most compassionate thing we can do, is separate from that panic. Otherwise, there's only panic.
Yes.
It's just a panicked child, and their skill set again is this big. Numbness, avoidance, isolation. There's no skill set there. They cannot, how could a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old possibly engage the complexity of that kind of grief? Well, he couldn't. So it is saturated and kind of hardened into this panicked place. Yes. So your gift to him is to help him separate. Can I be with this? Can I turn toward this like the mother I did not have? Can I turn towards this like the father I did not have? And there's tremendous vulnerability there. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you very much.
In the back of my book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, there is a writing practice back there that might be useful for him to do, which is, how do I separate from the child state? Because it's such an important thing and skill for us to have, is to know when and how this part of us shows up. Jung called them complexes. Trauma always generates complexes, fragmentary portions of consciousness that take over and possess us. So when he's near his grief, how old is he?
He's 34 now. But
So,
he's like he's 10.
well, exactly. So in that moment when the grief comes up, he's no longer 34.
No.
He becomes possessed by that consciousness. And what Jung discovered about that complex, which is so important for us to know now, is that imagination stops in this place.
Oh.
There is no imagination inside of a complex. You might know that in your own life, whenever those parts come up, it's the same story again and again, the same strategies again and again. So once we get some separation, we can bring an adult's imagination into that. How could I be with this part of me that's so scared? What does this part of me need? How can I be, and how can I accompany this part of me so it doesn't feel so alone? Yeah.
Thank
you for
you
the
very
question.
much.
Thank
We
you.
will work with him
Yeah,
and get those books.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
Thank you for opening your home and heart to a human being that
Yeah.
needs
Yeah.
it. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's been very hard through the pandemic because this young man would have been very much alone. You couldn't let that happen.
No.
No.
Thank you for your generosity.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have probably time for one last question. Jen. Maybe you can unmute yourself.
Jen? We only have a first name.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, yeah.
Hi, thank you.
Hello.
I feel my heart beating right now a little bit from just the breadth of conversation here, and I'm so grateful for everyone's shares and vulnerability, and I'm feeling very vulnerable right now. Just a little bit of context. I did leave home about 10, 11 years ago from a destructive family, something that was really tearing me down. And right before COVID hit, went traveling for 4 months and found myself coming back home, literally back to my father and stepmother's home in my old childhood bedroom, and feeling very isolated and disconnected from them because of these past destructive behaviors we were all entangled in. I'm very new to the awareness of grief, and I'm saturated in it right now with little knowledge. And you've touched on a lot of it here already with ritual and initiation and, going through these processes. I wonder on a really basic level, because I don't have anyone in my immediate connection, and like Kathy, yeah, sure, we can write to our grief and we can do these personal relating to it, but would you suggest also an opportunity to, if there were online grief groups or other situations that were available, would you suggest that for someone like me who is deep feeling in this grief right now and needs some holding and assistance? And where would we find those types of groups that would be able to hold us in this time? And if we don't already have a community built per se that can hold this for us right now. And so, yeah, something like that, register something.
Thank you for your tender heart as well. Yeah, I definitely would support you reaching out and finding some online community right now to help you hold this. Being too alone, well, two thoughts. One of them is the fiction of aloneness is part of what we have to challenge. We're never alone. I mean, the next breath you take in is tree breath and ocean breath, and and the light you're seeing me with is sunlight and starlight and moonlight. And we are caressed every moment by the singing, thrumming world. So you can even just go out and sit by a tree and tell the tree how much sorrow you're carrying. It will listen to you. Tell a stone all the ways your heart is breaking, and then dig a hole and give it to the earth, and let the earth change it into greenery and into mitochondria and magic. But by all means, absolutely talk to other human beings and just let people know what you're carrying. This is not a time, ironically, for us to go it alone, even though we are being asked to be very alone. Overcoming that tendency to privatize, to feel shame, to feel there's something wrong with me, nobody else is feeling this. Well, we're all feeling this. And that's what I call it, the communal or the commons of the soul. Everyone you see knows suffering, right? Everyone. No one has been exempt from that in this lifetime. So all we're doing is inviting us to come into the commons and be willing to become transparent and show just what we're carrying. And ironically, when we show our grief, we're also simultaneously revealing what is most authentic in us, most beautiful. I love going to grief rituals because there's no question asked about what people are feeling. They're on full display of what's in their hearts and souls. Grief wants to be expressed. It doesn't want to just be, we shouldn't have U-hauls behind us, of all the untouched grief. Part of what we want to do with grief work is that it helps to bring us current. We actually get to be in the present moment. Most of the time we're chewing on our pasts, on our ancestors' pasts. We're rarely in the current moment. And then on that other sense of that word, we're rarely in the electricity of life. We feel dulled and numbed by the weight of grief. So I want to be alive. The main thing is not so much happiness. We have become very addicted to happiness. I don't know why. But maybe the real issue is, how alive are you? And grief has tremendous vitality in it. It is not a deadening emotion at all. When we get near grief, we feel radically alive. So all praise to your aliveness. Bring that to an online community, talk to a tree, a stone, court your own soul at this time. This is holy time for you as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's amazing. One just quick comment. It's amazing how feeling back in this childhood home of mine, all my childlike tendencies of shame and numbness and repressing is just like flooding. So yeah, like really practicing honoring. Oh, yeah. I think my connection might have just got lost.
No, just like I was saying to Patricia.
If it did, I'm sorry, but
no.
Thank you.
We heard you.
Saying to Patricia, keep practicing the separation. Keep turning towards that child that feels shame. Turn toward that part that feels alone, isolated, cut off. Turn toward her over and over and over again with the utmost of kindness. Touch her with the softest hands possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jean.
Wow. Thank you, Jean. And somebody is offering, would it be okay, Francis, if can we create our own circle even online, like connect with 2 or 3 other people in this community or other community and do what you said, invite people for dinner, right? So we can create our own circle.
Yes, yeah, by all means. I mean, if you're not feeling grief right now, you're basically anesthetized. And it's not only grief that we're feeling, but that's a big piece of it. There's a lot of loss going on right now. And we have to have that capacity to, but again, we cannot do that alone. We do need to feel the arms of others. We need to feel tethered to other beings, human and more than human. That helps us hold what's going through us and moving through us. Yeah.
Wow, thank you, Francis. This was so rich and so soothing. I would just say too that this piece around we're not alone, we're not alone. Keep remembering that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really are not.
No.
We're not.
No. We are embedded in a net of relationships.
Yes.
Power in the old indigenous thought from many cultures was never personal. No. It was always derived. It was always a consequence of relatedness. And the more I feed the relationships that I'm in, to the sun and the moon and the stars, to the earth, to my friends, to my neighborhood, to my watershed, the more empowered I feel.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing we can do right now is cut off from connection. Because in our isolation, there's other things that happen that are not good. That are not good. Yeah.
So we're very close to the time, but I just would like to bring one more element into this, and that is the forgiveness.
Mm.
The element of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to add a little something to that?
Yeah. I've thought a lot about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness is very hard to will. So what I found is that the practice of self-compassion, the practice of compassion, makes possible the grace of forgiveness to arise. You know, if I'm going to forgive myself or another, it begins with the practice of compassion, to soften my heart. And that helps to create the conditions under which, like I say, the grace of forgiveness can arise.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're both blessed by that grace. You know, myself and the other, or if it's just my own self-forgiveness. But that requires kind of cultivating the field for that to come up, like a sweet flower, you know, something that blesses us.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Deep honor to be with you all. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you.